Everything is in standby. The background hum is steady and familiar. This is a slow, tactical sci-fi story, quiet enough to follow, gentle enough to sleep through. We came out of the refinery like men climbing out of a lung. The place had been dead for decades, but it still breathed. Every corridor held a slow draft that tasted of solvent and old fuel. The metal sweated. The pipes clicked as if something inside them was cooling down from a fever. When we went in, my suit readouts called it an industrial ruin. When we came out, my gut called it a mouth that had decided to let us go. The fog outside was the same as it had been 6 hours earlier, a low chemical haze that turned floodlights into pale disks and made distance unreliable. The moon's atmosphere wasn't thick enough to be called air, but thick enough to carry poison. The wind dragged acid brine from shallow pits and smeared it across the catwalks. It left a crust on our boots that ate at the polymer seams. I had a fracture in my right side from a fall inside the pipe stack. I could feel it every time the exosuit frame tried to help me breathe. The assist motors compensated, then overcompensated, then backed off in little cycles. The sensation was like a hand that didn't know when to stop squeezing. We were 8 on the way in, 7 on the way out. Nobody said anything. We were running on training and the last portion of stimulant that still made our hands steady. Comms were a soft hiss, jammed since we crossed the outer berm. The platoon's relay drone had died early, hit by something that didn't show on optics. After that, the only messages were the ones we wrote on the inside of our skulls. Our pickup point was a maintenance platform 2 kilometers across open scaffolding, past collapsed tanks, and a field of twisted rebar that used to be a pipeline bridge. The extraction timer lived in the corner of my visor. It had been optimistic before. Now it was a quiet accusation. We moved in a staggered line, each suit keeping a few meters from the next to avoid a single burst cutting us all. I watched the rear more than the front. I watched the gaps where fog got darker, where it looked like something had the decency to hide. The enemy never had that decency. They didn't hit us with artillery. They didn't need the drama. They came down from above, from the lattice of redundant pipes that hung over the catwalk like ribs. The first thing I saw was a ripple, a change in the way the fog refracted. Then the net hit. It wasn't a net-like rope. It was a web of conductive filament and adhesive beads that hardened the second it touched suit plating. It wrapped my shoulders and pinned my arms against my torso. My carbine clanged off the rail and disappeared into the haze below. The exosuit tried to compensate, motors whining, and the net drank the current like it had been waiting for it. The second thing that hit was the stun. A pulse through the filament. It wasn't pain. It was absence. My limbs went from heavy to irrelevant. My visor flashed white and then filled with error messages that meant nothing without time to read them. I fell, not with impact, but with the slow inevitability of a machine powering down. Through the ringing in my head, I heard bodies hitting metal. One suit went over the edge and didn't make a sound after. The fog swallowed him. I saw the others twitching in their webs, trying to trigger cutaway routines that the net had already shorted out. Then the auxiliaries appeared. They came in groups of 3 and 4, moving on jointed limbs that looked like insect legs made from scrap. They weren't machines in the clean way. They had damp surfaces. They left streaks. Their heads were blunt, with clusters of sensor pits instead of eyes, and their torsos bows with something that flexed like muscle under plating. They carried no rifles. They didn't need them. They had tools, hooks, clamps, injectors, and a kind of cutter that hissed without heat. They moved with the calm speed of something that had done this thousands of times. One of them leaned over me and pressed a clamp to the side of my helmet. The clamp bit into the metal and held. I felt a tug as it found the seam. My suit's internal warnings began to scream in visual icons, bright red shapes that meant breach. I tried to bite down on my own tongue to stay present. My jaw barely moved. They stripped us where we lay. They cut away pouches. They pulled our knives. They ripped the med injectors from our thigh slots. They didn't understand our gear, not exactly, but they understood function. Anything that could cut, burn, explode, or transmit got removed. Anything that looked like comfort, they ignored. They were not cruel in the human sense. They were thorough. When they got to my exosuit spine, they jammed a spike into the frame's power bus. The assist motors died instantly. The weight of the suit settled on my cracked rib like a slab. I heard one of our Marines scream once. It was short. It ended with a wet, choking sound. I couldn't turn my head to see who it was, but I didn't need to. Panic always chose the same victims, the ones still capable of it. The auxiliaries didn't react to the scream as an expression. They reacted to it as movement. Two of them pinned the screaming Marine's helmet to the deck. The third pressed a tool to the neck seal. The tool expanded, forcing the seal open. The chemical fog did the rest. The Marine's hands spasmed against the net for a few seconds, then went slack. The auxiliaries moved on. The body stayed. That was the first inventory change. They hauled us like cargo. The nets didn't come off. They attached cables to the filament, and the cables reeled us along the catwalk in a slow line. The auxiliaries walked beside us, occasionally prodding a body that sagged too much, ensuring it stayed alive enough to be useful. We passed under stacks of storage tanks that had collapsed into each other like dead animals. We passed a pit where the brine bubbled gently, not from heat, but from chemistry. Above, the refinery's superstructure faded into fog, a maze of beams and ducting. Somewhere inside that maze, we had placed charges and marked a relay organ, something grown into the metal that pulsed faintly on IR. We were supposed to be the people who mattered for an hour. Now, we were just warm shapes. They took us into a place that used to be a loading bay. The doors were gone. The floor was littered with broken crate frames and rust flakes. In the center, someone had built a pen from scrap beams and resin. The resin wasn't industrial, it was biological. It had a skin-like sheen, and it held the beams together as if it had grown there. They dragged us through a gap and then sealed it behind us with a fresh smear of resin that hardened in seconds. The pen had no comfort. It didn't need it. It had containment. Inside, the fog was thinner. The air smelled like metal and damp rot. My visor was still in place, but the aux clamp had damaged the seal. My internal oxygen indicator ticked down in small, steady increments. I could hear my own breath loud in my ears. It sounded like a stranger. They left us there. For a while, nothing happened except the slow return of function. The stun faded. Tingling came back into my fingers. My legs remembered they belonged to me. The net still pinned my arms, but I could flex my wrists and feel the filament cut into the suit fabric. I rolled my head carefully and counted shapes. 7 bodies. 1 not moving, the one who had breathed fog. The others were alive. Some were shaking. Some were too still. My own body felt distant, as if the pain belonged to someone I knew but didn't like. In the dim, I found the faceplate of our point man turned toward me. His visor was spiderwebbed from an impact. Behind it, his eyes were open and flat. Not dead, just empty of immediate thought. The unit tried to be a unit without words. It failed in small ways. Someone began to thrash, testing the net. The resin beams creaked. Another shoved at him with shoulder pressure, trying to conserve energy. A third curled inward, making himself small. The pen absorbed all of it and stayed unchanged. I focused on details. Details were safer than emotion. My left wrist torch was still mounted, but the power line had been cut. My suit's internal diagnostics were partially functional. The exosuit frame was dead weight. My thigh burns stung where acid had seeped under the seal on the way out. The med injector was gone, ripped out cleanly. I shifted my hips and felt the edge of something hard under the inner suit layer near my belt line. One breaching wafer. Ceramic, flat, designed to be ignored by casual scanners. I taped it there before the mission, a habit from earlier wars when capture meant being displayed on a feed. The auxiliaries hadn't found it, or they had and decided it wasn't worth their time. They were good. They were not human. Across from me, the one we all watched without wanting to admit it began to move. He had been exposed days earlier during a station clearance. A wetware core had been ruptured and sprayed the compartment with a mist of spores so fine the suit filters flagged it late. He was the one whose helmet seal had been compromised during that moment. They'd patched it. They'd flushed his lungs. They'd cleared him medically because the campaign didn't have the luxury of caution. After that, he had not been himself, not in any way that mattered in a war. His movements had become delayed, as if he waited for permission. He would stare at walls too long. His hands would tremble as if he was receiving distant instructions. The med tech had said neurological stress. The officers had said he could still carry weight. In the pen, with the stun fading, his eyes tracked the resin seams with a strange focus. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't pleading. He looked like someone listening to a radio we couldn't hear. He rolled his head toward me. The visor hid his expression, but I saw the subtle pulsing of his suit's inner collar lights, a diagnostic pattern that didn't match any human system. He raised his bound hands slowly. The net filament tightened and creaked. He didn't fight it. He simply held tension as if he was measuring it. Then his body went rigid. A seizure, I thought, because my mind likes known categories. It wasn't a seizure. It was synchronization. For a few seconds, the pen felt different. The air seemed to have a low vibration, not sound, but pressure. The resin beams gleamed faintly, as if something inside them had been energized. Then the feeling passed, and he slumped. His breathing remained even. If he felt anything, he didn't show it. The first time you see a mind break in war, you think it's tragic. The 20th time, you treat it like weather. You note it, you adjust, you move on. I had reached the weather stage. Time moved in the pen without markers. At some point, the gap in the resin opened. 2 auxiliaries entered, followed by a third that was larger and moved with more authority. This one had thicker plating and a cluster of protrusions on its back that could have been antennae or vents. It had a restraint rig trailing behind it, a frame of resin and metal with hooks. The larger auxiliary approached the infected Marine first. It examined him with a tool that brushed his helmet and left a wet streak. The infected Marine did not resist. His body was heavy and compliant, like a man already resigned. Then the auxiliary turned toward the biggest of our remaining Marines, a heavy weapons carrier whose suit had been stripped, but whose body still filled space. The auxiliary prodded his chest, then signaled with a gesture of its limb cluster. The hooks came out. They latched onto the net around the infected Marine and the heavy Marine. The rig reeled them toward the gap. The heavy Marine surged once, a reflexive attempt to stand. The hooks tightened and dragged him anyway. His boots scraped metal. His head struck a beam. He did not scream. The stun and exhaustion had taken that away. His eyes still held anger, and anger without action is a corrosive thing. The auxiliaries pulled both out and sealed the gap behind them. The pen got smaller. The unit's cohesion fractured in the way glass fractures, not with one break, but with a pattern that spread silently until it's everywhere. One Marine started to shake harder. Another pressed his helmet against a beam and remained motionless. I felt my own heart rate increase and then force it back down by focusing on breathing patterns. Inhale, count, exhale. No prayers, no hope, just mechanics. We had a narrowing window, and we all knew it. Not because anyone said it, but because war teaches timing with punishment. I shifted again and pressed my inner elbow against the suit fabric near my belt line, finding the wafer by feel. I needed access to it. I needed my hands free enough to place it. The net pinned my arms, but my wrists could move. The ceramic wafer had a peel tab that would arm it when pulled. It would burn through a lock, a hinge, a thin wall. It would also burn through flesh if placed wrong. It didn't care about intention. I began to work my bound hands toward my belt line in slow increments, using my body weight and the friction of the deck. It took time. Every movement made the net bite tighter. The filament had little barbs. It was designed to discourage exactly this. Pain became sharp around my wrists. I accepted it the way you accept cold. I got my fingers to the wafer tab after what felt like an hour and was probably 10 minutes. I hooked the tab with my fingertip and pulled. A tiny click in my suit, a vibration. The wafer armed, a 10-second timer began, invisible but absolute. I didn't have 10 seconds to think. I only had 10 seconds to place. I twisted my hips and shoved the wafer down to the deck with my bound hands, forcing it under the resin seam at the base of a beam. The resin was the pen's weak point. It held everything. If it failed, the beams would loosen. I pressed the wafer flat and tried to roll away. The net prevented graceful movement. I managed a half roll, shoulder-scraping metal. The wafer burned. There was no flame, just a white-hot chemical reaction contained inside ceramic. The resin hissed and bubbled. The beam shifted with a low groan. The smell was sharp, like hot plastic and something organic cooking. The seam failed. The beam loosened. The pen did not collapse, but it opened enough. We surged as one, not coordinated, not heroic, but driven by the same animal calculation. We shoved shoulders through the gap, scraping soup plating on jagged metal. The net still bound us, but bodies can do a lot, even when hands are useless. One Marine got through and immediately fell, legs tangled. Another went over him. The gap widened with the pressure. Resin tore with a wet sound. Outside the pen was the same loading bay, empty except for stacked scrap and the faint glisten of resin trails. The auxiliaries were not visible. That did not mean they weren't there. It meant they were patient. We crawled and stumbled toward shadowed cover behind a broken crate frame. Our movements were clumsy. We were not a strike team now. We were detainees who had become inconvenient. A shape dropped from above. It landed on the Marine nearest the gap, limbs splaying, tools flashing. It drove a clamp into the Marine's neck seal and began to open it with fast efficiency. The Marine's body convulsed. Fog seeped in. His hands were bound. He could not stop it. I saw the auxiliary sensor pits reflect my visor's faint glow. It turned toward me, calculating. I felt my body respond with the last reflex of combat training. I lunged, shoulder first, and slammed into it. The impact jarred my cracked rib and sent a bright spike of pain through my side. The auxiliary's limbs absorbed the hit, and it rolled, not losing balance but adjusting. My bound hands were useless, but my body mass wasn't. I drove my knee into its torso plating. Something wet inside it squelched. It did not scream. It simply tightened its grip and tried to return to task. Then the infected Marine did something that made the air change again. He wasn't in the bay. He was somewhere else, in whatever space they had dragged him to. But the effect of him reached us. The auxiliary on top of my teammate froze. Not like a machine powering down, like an animal suddenly listening. Its limbs trembled. Its tool arm lifted and then turned, not toward my teammate's neck seal, but toward its own torso seam. It stabbed itself once, hard, as if instructed to cut something out. Across the bay, another auxiliary emerged from the fog and did the same, tool arm twitching, stabbing into its own plating. For 2 heartbeats, the enemy's front line looked confused. Confusion in a machine ecology is never random. It is an intervention. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now in the flat way you understand a wound pattern after the bleeding stops. The infected Marine had reached into whatever control layer existed above the auxiliaries. He had not taken full control. He had pulled the lever that forced them into a contradictory directive: self-preservation against obedience, the kind of contradiction that breaks systems. The auxiliaries around us spasmed and began to destroy themselves with their own tools, cutting cables, puncturing wetware sacks, ripping off sensor clusters. The bay filled with wet metallic impacts and the smell of ruptured bioresin. It was not a victory. It was a momentary absence of opposition caused by a mind being used as a crowbar. We moved. We stumbled out of the loading bay into a corridor lined with dead conveyors. We dragged ourselves through a maintenance hatch that had been half torn off long ago. The hatch edges cut suit fabric. I felt warm liquid on my thigh, not sure if it was blood or acid brine. The comms hiss remained. No friendly signals, no orbital tone, nothing. In the maintenance duct, we paused long enough to count. 4 of us. Out of 7 alive in the pen, now 4. The ones taken for screening were not with us. The heavy Marine, the infected Marine. The ones killed during escape lay somewhere in the bay or the pen, their bodies already becoming part of the refinery's rust and resin. We did not speak. There was no dialogue, there was only breathing, the kind that becomes the soundtrack of survival. The duct sloped downward. Condensation dripped from above in slow drops that left faint burns on exposed suit layers. The air was warmer here, heavy with chemical fumes that the filters struggled to strip. My oxygen indicator ticked down faster. The clamp damage on my helmet seal had become a leak. I used my bound wrists to press against the net filament at a sharp edge of duct metal and began to saw. It was slow. The filament was strong. The metal edge was not sharp enough. My wrists bled under the suit fabric. I felt the wetness and ignored it. One of the remaining Marines, a thin recon operator, had managed to free one hand. He used his fingers to pick at the net around his other wrist. His movements were shaky. He kept glancing back into the duct, as if expecting pursuit. We were being pursued. The refinery had sensors. The auxiliaries were only one layer. Above them was something that had built this containment and this war. The duct opened into a vertical shaft that used to house a lift. The lift was gone. Only cables remained, hanging like dead vines. Far below, darkness. Far above, faint light filtered through grating. We had no rope. Our gear was stripped. We had our bodies and what scraps the enemy had not considered dangerous. I looked at the cables and made a decision with no ceremony. We climbed. It was slow. My exosuit frame made climbing harder, dead weight that shifted as I moved. My cracked rib protested each pull. I felt my grip slipping as blood slicked my palm inside the glove. Halfway up, the shaft vibrated with a low pulse. The kind of vibration that precedes machinery waking. Then the resin smell returned, stronger. From below, a soft scraping sound began, metal on metal, steady, purposeful. The auxiliaries had found the shaft, or something worse had. We climbed faster, not in panic, but in the cold understanding that being caught again would not mean another pen. It would mean being processed. At the top, the recon operator pushed through a grate and rolled onto a catwalk. The Marine behind him followed. I came last, pulling myself up with the last strength in my shoulders. The catwalk ran along the inside of a massive processing chamber. Below, machinery lay in ruin, crushed centrifuges, cracked tanks, belts torn like skin. Resin had grown across parts of it, forming slick bridges and nodules that pulsed faintly. On the far side, an opening led into a corridor marked with old hazard symbols. I recognized it from the map overlays we'd used earlier. It was one of the routes to the extraction platform. If extraction still existed. We moved along the catwalk in crouched, bound awkwardness. Each step made the metal ring. The fog inside the chamber was minimal, but dust hung in the air, conductive grit that sparkled when my visor lights caught it. At the midpoint, the infected Marine appeared. Not walking, not carried, he was suspended. He hung from the ceiling by resin tendrils that wrapped his suit like vines. His limbs were spread slightly, held in place. His helmet was intact, but the visor was dark. His suit collar lights pulsed in the wrong pattern again, faster now, like a heartbeat that had forgotten how to be calm. Below him, something stood on the machinery wreckage. It was not an auxiliary. It was larger, smoother, with a central mass that glistened like wet metal. Around it, smaller tool limbs moved in precise patterns. It was connected by cables and resin veins into the chamber walls. It didn't need to chase. It was the chamber. The infected Marine's head twitched. Slowly, as if pulled by strings, it turned toward us. For a second, my visor caught his face through the plate, pale and slack, eyes open but not focusing on the catwalk. He looked past us, through us. Then his suit collar lights surged bright, and the chamber vibrated again. The thing below responded instantly. Two limbs snapped upward. A filament shot out and wrapped the infected Marine's neck seal. It tightened, not to kill quickly, to enforce silence. The infected Marine's body convulsed once, hard, as if trying to do something against that constraint. The auxiliaries we'd seen self-stab in the bay were not random. They were a spillover effect, a brief glitch in an obedient network. Here, under direct supervision, the network corrected itself. The infected Marine's collar lights dimmed. His body went still, but not dead, just contained, like an organ in a jar. I understood something then with the same numb clarity you get when you see a friend executed and realize the war has rules you don't control. He had been useful. Now he was a conduit. They were not interrogating him in the way humans interrogate. They were wiring him into their system. We could not save him. We moved on because the alternative was joining him. As we edged along the catwalk, the recon operator's freed hand slipped on dust. His boots skidded. The metal rang louder than before. The chamber responded. From the walls, small drones detached, spider-like, moving with speed and silence. They crawled along the underside of the catwalk toward us. Their bodies were thin, almost delicate, but their limbs ended in cutters. The Marine ahead of me tried to kick one away. His bound arms threw off his balance. He fell against the rail and nearly went over. I grabbed his suit collar with my bound wrists, anchoring him. My cracked rib flared with pain so bright it made my vision narrow. One of the drones reached my boots and latched on. It began to cut at the ankle seal, not frenzied, but methodical. I had no weapon. I had no free hands. I had only weight and movement. I stomped. The drone's body crushed under my boot with a wet crunch, like stepping on a bag of fluid. The cutter limbs still twitched. Another drone latched on instantly, replacing it. The recon operator, trembling, used his freed hand to rip one drone off the rail. He flung it into the chamber below. It fell and disappeared into resin. The Central Intelligence did not look up. It already knew. We reached the corridor opening and dropped into it, leaving the catwalk behind. The corridor was narrower, lined with old insulation that hung in strips. Resin had crept along the floor in veins. The air was colder here. My breath fogged my visor. Behind us, the scraping sound increased. The drones were coming. We ran in the way exhausted people run. Not fast, but continuous. Bodies moving because stopping means death. The corridor opened into a junction where the walls were marked with faded arrows toward loading, toward control, toward emergency egress. The emergency egress arrow pointed into a hatch half buried under fallen pipe. I made another decision. We went into the hatch. Inside was a service tunnel, low and tight. We crawled. Resin brushed our suits like sticky hands. The tunnel smelled like old oil and biological damp. Halfway through, the Marine in front of me began to cough. His suit filter was failing. Each cough sounded wet. In this atmosphere, wet meant leakage. We reached an exit grate that opened onto the exterior catwalk network near the extraction platform. The platform was visible through fog as a darker rectangle. The beacon light that should have been there was off. No dropship shadow, no engine roar, no rescue. The extraction window had closed. Whether because command never got our relay or because the war had moved on, didn't matter. The result was the same. We were alone on a toxic moon inside an enemy machine, ecology. The drones emerged behind us, crawling out of the service tunnel like insects from a wound. We did not have time for careful tactics. We had time for brutal physics. I slammed my shoulder into the recon operator, pushing him toward the platform. He stumbled but kept moving. The other Marine followed, dragging his bound arms awkwardly. I turned and threw myself at the first drone wave. They latched onto my suit, cutters biting into fabric and sealant. I felt cold air kiss my skin through a new tear. My oxygen indicator began to drop faster. I rolled on the catwalk, crushing drones under my body weight, grinding them against metal grating. Their bodies burst wetly. The cutters kept moving until they were destroyed. More came. I felt something sharp pierce my thigh burn, deeper. A cutter had found flesh. The pain was distant, a signal from a system already overloaded. In the fog, a larger auxiliary shape approached, moving with that same calm. It carried a restraint rig. They wanted us back. I pushed myself up, bound arms still useless, and ran toward the platform. My vision narrowed, the edges of my visor filled with warning icons: oxygen loss, seal breach, blood loss, hypoxia. The platform's edge loomed. Beyond it, open fog and the drop to brine pits. I saw a maintenance ladder leading down to a lower level where old fuel lines ran. If we could get into the line tunnels, we might find a route to a comm node, or at least a place to die slower. The recon operator went down first. The other Marine followed, coughing wetly. I started down last. As my boot found the ladder rung, a drone cutter bit into my calf seal. The seal tore. Cold chemical air flooded in. My body reacted with a spasm of breath that burned. My lungs tried to reject it. My visor fogged from inside. I climbed anyway, each rung a mechanical act. No prayers, no hope, just movement. Below, in the line tunnel, darkness swallowed us. We crawled for what felt like kilometers but was probably a few hundred meters. The tunnel vibrated occasionally with distant impacts, drones above, auxiliaries searching. The resin smell faded, replaced by old fuel odor that made my throat tighten. My oxygen indicator hit critical. At that point, time becomes a thick substance. Each breath is a choice between choking and poisoning. Each thought is slow. We found a dead comm node embedded in the tunnel wall, an old emergency transmitter with a cracked casing. It had no power from the grid, but it had a manual spool, a primitive coil that could generate a small charge if cranked. The recon operator's freed hand tried to work it. His fingers were clumsy from cold and fear. He managed a few turns. A small light flickered on, weak and unstable. I pressed my helmet against the node, lining up my suit's damaged comm port with its interface. The system tried to handshake and failed. I tried again. The node's light flickered. The other Marine collapsed beside us, coughing, then not coughing, then making a soft sound as his breathing stopped. His suit collar lights went dark. His body remained warm for a while. Then it began to cool. The recon operator kept cranking until his arm shook. The light held. I began to record because it was the only thing left that resembled duty. My voice in the helmet sounded distant to me, as if someone else had borrowed my mouth. I kept it factual. I kept it slow. I described the interception, the pen, the loss, the thing in the chamber. I did not describe feelings because feelings were not useful data. I described the infected Marine's containment because it mattered. I described the extraction failure because it explained why no one should send more people here without a plan. Halfway through, the node's light dimmed. The recon operator's cranking slowed. His breath came in wet gasps. He was losing his filter too. I kept recording until the system cut out. Silence returned, heavy as metal. In the dark tunnel, I could hear small scraping sounds again, distant but approaching. The drones were patient. The intelligence was thorough. It would not forget us. My oxygen hit 0 shortly after. At 0, the suit does not instantly kill you. It gives you what it can from compressed reserves, then nothing. My lungs burned. My vision filled with gray static. My body tried to inhale and found only thin poison. I lay on the cold tunnel floor and listened to the recon operators breathing beside me. It was ragged. It slowed. The scraping sound drew closer, steady as a clock. In my visor, the last active display was a faint reflection of my own faceplate, scratched and fogged, with warning icons blinking like distant stars. I focused on one sensory detail to anchor myself, a habit from older wounds: the taste of the air. It tasted like batteries and rust and something organic that had learned to live in metal. The recon operator's breathing stopped with a final exhale that never drew back in. The scraping sound reached the tunnel entrance and paused, as if the enemy was listening to confirm we were no longer effort. I did not move. Movement was gone. Thought was thick and slow. The last thing I remember clearly is a single drop of condensation falling from the tunnel ceiling onto my cheek, cold and slightly burning, and the sound it made when it hit skin. A small sound, almost nothing, inside a refinery that still breathed. The end. The narrative releases its hold, leaving only calm behind. Nothing approaches, nothing shifts. Stay in this moment as long as you like.